Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Merci de nous avoir rejoints aujourd'hui auprès de l'Institut pour la paix et la diplomatie. Je m'appelle Zachary Paikin et je suis chercheur non résident auprès de l'Institut. My name is Zach Paikin. I am a non-resident research fellow with the Institute. And we're grateful to be welcoming you all today to be discussing a very timely and important issue, namely what future for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, nearly 1 year now after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO does appear 1 year later, more united and more confident of its purpose than at any time in recent memory. Emmanuel Macron's infamous comment made as recently as 2019 that the transatlantic alliance was brain dead now seems to be a thing of the distant past. That said, the tasks confronting the alliance do remain momentous. Inter alia, these include how to manage a possibly protracted confrontation with Russia and its accompanying risks of escalation, how to craft a new European security after the war, and of course, manage questions of balance and burden sharing between both sides of the alliance, and then, of course, how to handle the complex dynamics of an increasingly multipolar world. So here to unpack us, help us unpack this, today, is an intellectually diverse group of experts, scholars, and former government officials who can really shed some excellent insight on these questions, coming from Canada, the United States, and Europe. So without further ado, Kerry Buck is the former Canadian ambassador to NATO from 2015 to 2018, as well as a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. Kerry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us again at IPD today. George Beebe is Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C., as well as the former Chief of Analysis for the Russia Analysis Group at the CIA from 2005 to 2007. George, thanks for joining us again at IPD. Daniel Fiat is head of the Defense and Statecraft program at the Brussels School of Governance. Daniel, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for taking the time. Lee Sardi, former deputy head, of mission at the Canadian Embassy in Moscow from 2012 to 2016. It's a pleasure to see you and to welcome you to IPD for the first time. And a regular of ours at IPD, Paul Robinson, senior fellow with us here at IPD, as well as professor of public and international affairs at the University of Ottawa. Kerry, if you don't mind, we're going to start with you. I was wondering if you could just share your insights. In your view, what would you say has been the most significant development for NATO over the course of the past year? Or perhaps put differently, which action or transformation undertaken by NATO and its members is most likely to stand the test of time?
So you've asked me to answer with one thing, so I will be disobedient and answer with three. Three takeaways from the last year. First, political cohesion. I was political director when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, and there was political cohesion then, and there was a response with sanctions and some messaging. But the strength and the solidity of the cohesion and the response was more than even I expected. Second, US leadership is alive and well, but at the same time, I saw the EU or European allies step up, particularly on capability, development, procurement, and deployment in ways that I hadn't expected, and it was very welcome. And then third, NATO can walk and chew gum at the same time, because it also adopted a new strategic concept for the next couple of decades and recognized that it has to look wider, has to look to China, and has to look to new technologies, new areas of threat, Arctic climate, high north climate, cyber, etc.
Excellent. Thank you, Kerry. You've raised a lot of themes that we're going to unpack over the course of the webinar, but I want to pick up on one of them and turn to George right now, which is the question of unity among NATO member states. And I'm wondering, George, in your perspective, how much is the unity on display today substantive and durable, or is it really more, in your view, let's say, the product of unique and temporary circumstances, and therefore those circumstances may be papering over certain differences among allies that will remain and might become significant in the event of, for example, the need for talks surrounding a ceasefire, let's say, in Ukraine at some point in the months or years ahead?
Well, I think we've already passed the high water mark of NATO unity in the past year, and I think part of that is because NATO's purpose has, I think, radically changed over the past year or so. In the aftermath of the Cold War, NATO became essentially a political organization in a lot of ways. It was attempting to spread values. It became essentially evangelical. Its purpose was to provide an umbrella so that liberal governance could move eastward over time. And the Russians have essentially said, no, you've gone far enough eastward. We don't accept that you're actually a political organization. We don't like the idea of intrusive interference in values that we don't necessarily share here. And although you say Russia doesn't have a veto over NATO's eastward expansion, in fact, we do. It's called war. What this has done, I think, is forced NATO to a transition point. Is it going to continue to be what it was becoming in the 1990s? Something that was trying to spread values and to create a universal approach to governance in the transatlantic region? Or is it going to be primarily a military organization? When it comes to that question of what NATO ought to be doing and how it ought to be doing it, I don't think there is, in fact, a lot of consensus in the organization. There are some dissenters, some very strong dissenters about its evangelical mission. And there are also some very strong dissenters about just to what degree NATO ought to be engaging in a military confrontation with Russia. How much of this is defensive? How much of it is offensive? And I think there are real differences between France and Germany on the one hand, Poland and the Baltic states on the other on these issues. And we haven't even talked about Turkey and Hungary, for example. I think there's a lot more difference of opinion in the organization than is apparent in the way the organization reacted to Russia's invasion, which I think everybody could comfortably say was wrong and should be resisted. But now we're moving beyond that to, okay, what do we do now? And that's an area where I think we're going to see a lot more difference within the alliance than what we saw over the past year.
Thanks very much. Let's turn to Daniel now and talk about the equilibrium between both sides of the alliance, which has been one source of disagreement or disunity over recent years. Some claim that Europe has grown more dependent on the United States and less capable of strategic autonomy as a result of this war. But there are others at the same time who suggest that Europe has woken up. It's getting more serious about its defense now. There are calls for a more European NATO, et cetera. So can you help us unpack that, right? Are there elements of truth in both accounts?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I think it really depends on how you define European strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty. My own impression is that actually we've got both kind of forces happening at the same time, if that doesn't sound too strange, which is on the one hand, the fact that the US have played this kind of overarching leadership position, which has allowed Europeans to squabble amongst themselves, essentially, and to come to some agreement on how best to respond to the war in Ukraine. And I mean, we won't ever be able to do this, I guess, at least not in the present day, but taking the US out of the equation, it would have been very interesting to see how Europeans themselves would have got to grips with some of the major questions surrounding Ukraine. So what level of support, questions about how far you enter into negotiations with Russia in the future. Those types of hard questions are being all managed, I think, relatively peacefully between Europeans under the context of US leadership. I think, though, that, you know, when President Macron spoke about NATO being brain dead, I mean, it's Russia who has imposed some degree of rationality and order on the way NATO thinks. But I think underlying that, there is still cause for concern about the unity of at least European NATO allies. And that's not something exclusively problematic in a NATO context, but it is also problematic in an EU context where you see this almost, I won't go as far as calling it a schism, but tensions between the so-called old and new Europe, to use those horrible phrases. So that is something that we have to keep our minds on. And then one final point, I mean, the other issue is that we are thinking of NATO exclusively in the context of the war on Ukraine. But actually, NATO has another big question to answer, and I think it's already been touched upon by George and by Kerry, which is also the, let's say, increase in responsibilities, and in particular, focusing on now the Indo-Pacific and China, right? So if the US are very much clear on the fact that China is the #1 priority, that will have some spillover effect into NATO thinking. The problem there is not all NATO European members actually agree with that kind of assessment. And if they do agree that China is a threat, they want to respond to it in very different ways. Hence, you see Europeans sometimes leaning more into the EU when it comes to the question of China than NATO. So that is, I think, a longer term issue that the alliance really has to get to grips with. And that in a context where anything can also change in the domestic political situation in the US as well. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Zach.
Got it. Thank you, Daniel. We'll unpack some of those bigger picture issues a little bit later in the panel, but with the 1-year anniversary of the war coming up, let's zero in on NATO's approach towards the Ukraine war in particular and bring Paul Robinson into the discussion. Paul, Russia has conducted a seemingly orderly withdrawal from Kherson shortly after annexing it. So this has led many people in the West to conclude that the risk of escalation, for example, to nuclear use is not as high as many had thought, despite the threats that Vladimir Putin had put forward, in his speech just prior to annexing these territories. So in your sense of things, does Putin indeed have no red lines, or are those red lines shifting? And for example, what can all of this tell us about how durable the West strategy is when it comes to this war as it relates to Russia's shifting red lines?
Well, you ask me to get inside the brains of the Kremlin, which is not something I like to try and do because we don't know. Let's be quite honest. And I've read so many articles of you saying what Putin wants, 90% of which are garbage. So it's not particularly on the issue of nuclear weapons. I think there would have to be some particularly very dire scenario because there were many forms of escalation open to the Russian Federation short of nuclear power. For instance, it has so far not deployed conscripts into the battle. But legally speaking, now it's annexed these territories. They are part of the territory of the Russian Federation. Conscripts could be used there without having any change in the law, right? So, there's simple methods of escalation which are available, including more mobilization of people and so on and so forth, which have not yet been done, which fall far. And I think you'd have to go up through some sort of ladder of escalation where all those things have been tried and failed before you are talking about nuclear weapons. But as far as sort of red lines are concerned, we have, I think it's very clear that certain things are non-negotiable from a Russian point of view. Some of these are territorial. And I think having, the status of Crimea is obviously non-negotiable. And I think having so clearly put the future of Donbass in the center of its conflict, the future of Donbass is non-negotiable too, I would say. I simply cannot conceive of any Russian government negotiating those away. It would have to be pulled out of their dead fingers, to be quite honest. If we're talking about, Zaporozhia, what remains of Kherson province, maybe there might be some wiggle room. But as I said in a previous seminar, there's some constitutional issues which now get in the way and make even that non-negotiable. But I also imagine that's non-negotiable from the Ukrainian side. And therefore, I think we're at an impasse. And I don't personally. I've mentioned this in a previous talk we've had, Zach. I don't actually see any way of getting past this. Personally, I know George thinks that we should at least try. I kind of don't see how we can succeed, but that's how I see it from the Russian point of view. What sort of things they won't go beyond. Issues that also insisting still on neutralization, denazification, demilitarization. I think in due course they will probably have to accept that those are unachievable, and they could possibly be quietly put to one side in some final settlement, but the territorial issue, I don't think, is going to be negotiable.
Gotcha. Let's bring Lee into the discussion now. And Lee, you served in Moscow, so I'm wondering if you can provide your evaluation of the West's strategic response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine to date, and whether or not we've crafted that response in a fashion that is, best and sensitive to Russia's various incentive structures, calculations, and the way that it reads strategic pressures and the like. It basically, is this an effective strategy for dealing with Russia as you understand Russian foreign policy?
Absolutely, Zachary. I think we're doing what we can do, and certainly the language of force is a language that that Putin and his cronies understand very clearly. But I would take the opportunity to pick up on what Paul was saying, that we need to appreciate. I also agree with Paul. Is 90% of what one reads about what Putin wants is pure speculation. But I think we can and should be very clear on those respects in which we do understand where Putin is coming from. In other words, that this, while the actual decision to cross into Ukraine last February caught me and I think 99% of even close Russian analysts by surprise. Many of us, understood he was playing politics with the situation, but the idea he would take that leap seemed just beyond fathoming. But it's a classic case of Monday morning quarterbacking, that we have to keep reminding ourselves how logical this war is from the perspective of Putin. From Putin, given his background, given his understanding at the pinnacle of the Russian system of developments, certainly since the end of the Cold War, and arguably over centuries, in terms of these deep-seated grievances, insecurities, suspicions about the West. And so the fact that he was willing to undertake this action, again, clearly under delusional intelligence, but nevertheless, as the situation has evolved, I think we have to appreciate the degree to which the Russians are capable of learning and appreciating that they are in a different situation. And I think most important of all, we have to appreciate the depth of their political commitment to what they're doing. Hence, again, Paul's depressing words, impasse, from a Russian perspective, when you understand how dug in they are, as the operation has very, very quickly moved from their initial delusion of we'll take Kiev in 3 days to this positional trench warfare. As we speak, the Russians are beginning to throw up to however many 100,000 new recruits based on the fall mobilization. And for them, it is so much a fight to the death that I think distinguishes their approach to this conflict absolutely from NATO's. And one of the reasons why there is the room for division on NATO's side that was being discussed so clearly earlier is precisely because there are a range of views on the NATO side in terms of how we prioritize our values, our commitment to Ukraine, our self-interest, our economic requirements, US presidential elections coming up, all these facts. Whereas for Russia, the way the narrative has been spun and continues to be spun by the Kremlin is one that is increasingly, astonishingly visceral, a matter of life and death. I mean, one data point is Foreign Minister Lavrov literally was quoted as saying, just as Nazi Germany sought a final solution to the Jewish question, so the West today seeks a final solution to the Russia question. That this is serious discourse, and Putin's speech at Stalingrad, at Volgograd, marking the Stalingrad battle. I think this is, I think we really have to keep these aspects of the Russian approach front and center as we grapple with how NATO will continue to meet this challenge going forward. But to come back to where you began, I think certainly to this point, NATO's response has been absolutely appropriate and needs to remain firm going forward.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lee. Just a reminder to our audience that you can pose questions to our panelists using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're going to try to get to as many of those as we can a little bit later on. But let me come back to George right now, and let's expand the discussion a bit to discuss the future of Europe's security order after the war, whenever that indeed may be. Now, one of the major disagreements between Russia and the West over recent decades has concerned NATO's open door policy, and you highlighted that a little bit earlier. And some suggest that this war is evidence of the fact that the open door policy has now run out of road because Russia has a military veto, so to speak, if not a diplomatic veto. But now you've even got Henry Kissinger saying that neutrality for Ukraine is no longer meaningful. So I'm wondering if, in your perspective, realist and restraint-oriented thinkers should reconsider the value of Ukraine's neutrality going forward.
Well, I think we should, yes. I don't see a solution to this war that Russia can buy into that does not involve Ukrainian neutrality of some form. And you know, the reason for that, I think, is a fairly simple one. The Russians regard the possibility of Ukraine's alliance with NATO or with the United States bilaterally, either officially or unofficially, as an existential threat. And that's one of the reasons why I was among the, 0.1%. This is a real possibility if the United States and NATO were not willing to consider a compromise, which we were not. And I was not surprised that the Russians actually launched an invasion. I thought that it was avoidable, and I do think that the path out of this situation is going to have to be some sort of compromise over Ukraine's geostrategic orientation. Now, is that going to be a difficult compromise to hash out under the circumstances that we're facing? Absolutely. An agonizingly difficult situation to manage. But I do think that the alternative to doing that is going to be one of two things. One possibility is an escalation that will be difficult to control, that goes both horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, I think it draws the West into the war in a much more direct way. Vertically, it starts to get toward the use of space warfare, for example, and could potentially get to the nuclear level. Not because rational actors on either side decide that that's a good thing to do, but because we get into a situation where one or both of the sides have to make a choice between humiliation and all of the ramifications of that, and resorting to nuclear use, which is not the kind of decision memo that anybody should be sending up the chain of command, I don't think. If it doesn't escalate, then I think, and we don't compromise in some way, then I think what's going to happen is Ukraine is just going to be wrecked. It's going to be wrecked physically, economically, and societally. That's Russia's plan B. If they can't get some sort of compromise with the West over Ukraine's geostrategic orientation, then plan B is to render Ukraine in such a condition that it cannot join with anybody. It's simply incapable. And that would be an enormous tragedy, first and foremost for the people of Ukraine. So I think, it's very much to be avoided. Can we do that? And although the analytic side of me, I think, is very sympathetic with Paul Robinson's point that this is, going to be a very, very difficult situation to find a settlement in. The policy side of me, the part that says, well, what should we do, does not believe we should throw up our hands and say, too tough. We're just going to have to accept those other outcomes, because I think those other outcomes would be catastrophic.
Zachary, can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Just on that, I mean, those words, needing to accept some sort of compromise over Ukraine's geostrategic orientation. Truer, good realist words could not be spoken, George, and I agree wholeheartedly. But what I would like to take this opportunity to flag that we have to be mindful of, obviously we all are, but that what makes it so difficult, and I think gives a little more credence to Paul's talk of impasse, is sure, that solution is out there as very cut and dried, but can we, as Western democratic governments, for governments that need to keep popular support, this is certainly the case in Canada, I think it's the case in all countries, where Foreign policy is seen as a way to promote our values. And as you see in the discourse, the way, well, those of us who've been following events for the last 30 years appreciate that Ukraine's path to stability, democracy, et cetera, has not been without a few road bumps, are a bit dismayed as we see, completely for understandable reasons, why the rhetoric around this war is so charged with promotion of values. While Zelensky is rightly hailed as a hero, but it doesn't necessarily follow, while it has to be said for the sake of domestic support that we are fighting for the future of democracy and Western values in Ukraine, realities are potentially ultimately otherwise if we want to see some sort of resolution here. So I would come back. Sadly. While my head absolutely agrees with you, George, and I do think that is the path to some sort of resolution. My heart or appreciation of the politics of all this for the West is among the factors that put me squarely in the Robinson Gloom camp, if we can begin to with that.
What a wonderfully named camp. Kerry, go ahead, and then I'm going to give George the chance to respond to both of you if he wants. Go ahead, Kerry.
Okay, I too am falling into the Robinson Gloom camp, and I think we'll put capital letters on that. The problem is I don't see a solution to the war that does not allow for Ukraine in one way or the other to continue to align itself with the West. Part of it is Zelensky and any Ukrainian leader now would have zero political space inside the country to agree to much of a compromise on, particularly not on territory, but there's not much that there would be space to compromise on because of the way in which the war has been prosecuted and the atrocities. But on the NATO side, I think, values aside, and I don't disagree with you, I also think it's in NATO allies' hard security interests to make sure that they do two things. And those two things don't work together. One, they can't have this war end in a place where Russia will try again, which is what happened. We were too weak after 2008 and even too weak after 2014. So Russia tried again. Nor can we leave Russia in a space where it's wrecked and humiliated, shades of, the interwar period, etc. So where does the compromise lie? At some point, compromise will be required. It's absolutely not now. I don't think there's the political space for it. I don't think it's the security interest place for it right now of NATO allies. Compromise, you remember the deal that Russia put on the table January, just before they started the ill-fated invasion. And a Moscow newspaper said, oh, look, President Putin is now asking the West for a unicorn for Christmas. There were things in that compromise proposal that nobody in Russia, it was clear there was no deal to be had. The people who were negotiating that deal, Wendy Sherman on the US side and Sergei Ryabkov on the Russian side, they'd done the Iran nuclear deal together. If there was a deal to be had, they would have found it. There was no deal to be had then. So we've got, unfortunately, to put a lot of space and time between that posturing of what Russia said they wanted out of the war, the political space that is narrowed for both Ukrainian and NATO leaders to agree to a compromise, and whatever's going to happen down here. But the problem is, I agree entirely with you, George, that a drawn-out war will wreck Ukraine, and that's in nobody's interests, not even Russia's interest, I would argue. So I can't come up with a solution, which is why I fall into the impasse camp.
George, do you want to come back on any of that?
Well, yeah. I don't think the key compromise here has to involve territory. In fact, I would argue that it shouldn't involve territory. And a lot of people that argue against some sort of settlement argue that, it would be a mistake to make any compromises on territory, and B, that would only, invite more aggression. It would potentially destabilize Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that a compromise over territory is possible right now. But I also don't think that that's the key to ending the fighting. I think both sides could conceivably live with a situation in which they disagree on territory and neither side recognizes the legitimacy of the other's territorial claims. But that the fighting can reach a durable armistice or ceasefire based on a strategic compromise between the United States and Russia, frankly, which I think is at the heart of what this war is about. And that strategic compromise is that the United States is going to say, you know what, we're not going to have a military alliance with Ukraine, and neither will NATO. And that is what the Russians have demanded for quite some time, dating back well before 2008, when the NATO alliance in Bucharest announced that Ukraine and Georgia would become one day members of the NATO alliance. And recall at the time, public opinion polling in Ukraine back in 2007 and 2008 indicated that a minority of Ukrainians favored joining NATO. So this was not a Ukrainian demand-driven approach at the time. And frankly, great numbers of NATO allies also opposed Ukrainian and Georgian membership in NATO at the time. It was the United States that pushed that forward. I think it was a strategic mistake then, and I think we're seeing to a great degree the fruits of that today. So can the United States find a way gracefully of stepping down from that position? If we can't, if we won't, then I do think we're headed toward either escalation or the wrecking of Ukraine. And this is not an issue that the Ukrainians have to decide, quite frankly, and they can't decide that. They can apply for membership in NATO. They have done so, but it is up to the alliance to decide whether it wants to accept it or not. And if we actually put this to a vote, I believe that the alliance would not accept Ukraine at this point. So, all we're doing essentially in compromising here is A, finding a way to orchestrate the domestic political aspects of this, and B, acknowledging reality, which is Ukraine's not going to be a member of NATO anytime soon. So I think it's very much in our interest to grasp the nettle on this, because the alternative to doing that, I think, is going to be quite disastrous.
Well, George just raised the 2008 Bucharest summit, which, some analysts would say merely provoked Russia without providing Ukraine with any tangible security guarantees, by not actually moving in the direction of concretely advancing Ukraine's membership prospects. But Kerry, the issue is that even if we were to, go down that path of discussing what sort of tangible security guarantees, we'd be prepared to offer Ukraine, the issue is Western countries are clearly not prepared to fight for Ukraine now. So why would they offer security guarantees at some point in the future and pledge that they would fight for them in the future if Russia were to reinvade? So how do we get around this problem? On the one hand, you don't want to provide tangible guarantees. On the other hand, you need to provide tangible guarantees if this is not to be repeated. So how do you square that circle? Are we just doomed to inhabit a Europe without a peace dividend for decades to come?
I think the short answer is yes. The question is how nasty and how hot that conflict is, how cold. There were security guarantees for Ukraine, and no, the West is not willing to enter into a direct war with Russia. They're coming close to that line. I think they're doing the right thing, because the cost of having Russia take over Ukraine is very high. I don't see the appetite or the rationale necessarily stopping. And I don't mean that Putin's next step, if he had been successful in Ukraine, would have been to invade NATO allies. I don't mean that in a conventional war sense, but that shift in Russian military doctrine of coercive use of cross-domain instruments, blah, blah, I'm talking military stuff, but the idea of using civilian tools to destabilize, that's been part of Russian playbook for a while now, and it's actually been pretty successful. Less successful in the Ukraine war than maybe we expected, but pretty successful in terms of destabilization and creating societal rifts inside countries and also at the NATO table. So is that something that NATO can, or the Western allies can have sitting on its doorstep in one of the largest countries in Europe, and one of the countries in Europe, Ukraine, that could be very economically viable? I don't think so, which brings me back to the impasse. I don't think for their own security interests that NATO allies can afford to back away and leave Ukraine entirely to their own devices, nor do I think it would be a grave mistake to cross that line and enter into direct fighting. Impasse.
Go ahead, Paul.
I could jump in here. I mean, I think we're heading for the impasse, but I think what's important is how we react to that. And you know, unlike Kerry, I have a more pragmatic view of the Russian threat. I mean, the Russians are taking 7 months to capture Bakhmut. They're not going to be marching on Berlin. Let's be quite honest about this. Yeah. So to me, what I'm worried about this is going to be used to massively boost NATO's responsiveness. Will be to demand massive boosts in defense spending. I'm already talking about necessity to massively increase stockpiles of weapons and ammunition. This is because the war is showing that conventional war between states uses up a vast amount of ammunition. And so NATO is already pushing states to do something about this. But this only makes sense if your aim is to fight a conventional interstate war. In other words, if your aim is to commit suicide. And to be actively preparing for this, from my point of view, it would be a huge mistake, because as I said, the Russians are not going to be advancing on Berlin. And, you know, the idea that we need to have a vast arsenal to prepare for this extremely unlikely eventuality is potentially dangerous, because once you have a large armed force sitting around doing nothing, that ends up being a temptation to use it. I go back to famous conversation Colin Powell and Madeleine Albright about bombing Serbia, and Colin Powell said, you know, this is an appropriate use for the army, and Madeleine Albright said, what's the point of having this great army you're talking about if we never use it? Okay, and that temptation is there. Overwhelming military power leads to the use of military power, and we've seen in the past 30 years that we've used it in a lot of very inappropriate ways, which have brought us no good. So I think that, you know, massively rearming as a result of this would be a big mistake. I'm also a lot more phlegmatic about this idea of Russian subversion. I don't see, you know, the Russians as massively dividing our societies or having any deep success in any regard in that respect. And in any case, even if it was true, the only solution to it is the kind of solution George is talking about, which actually make an agreement with it. Okay, as long as you have some degree of hostility, this kind of, you might call it political struggle, will continue. Okay, and armed force is certainly no solution to it. The only solution to it is some sort of political settlement. So I'm afraid that we'll end up drawing entirely the wrong conclusions from this and pushing our policy in the wrong direction, particularly if we then go further and start deciding we need to contain China. If I just say one last thing, I saw a headline the other day about a agreement the Americans had signed for the Philippines for bases. I think it was on the BBC, and it said, United States completes arc of bases around China. And I thought, isn't that interesting, right? You know, it's not China completes arc of bases around the United States. It's United States completes arc of bases around China. And if we're going to start getting NATO involved in all that, then I think we're going down a very dangerous way, because, you know, the Chinese aren't going to regard that as a defensive act. And I don't think the Chinese will regard us, NATO getting involved in Asia Pacific, as a defensive act. So I think we need to be very, very careful going forward.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Paul. Daniel, in fact, Paul just raised this issue of basically the Russians are having difficulty marching on Bakhmut, to say nothing of Berlin. So basically, you know, the Russian army is not 10 feet tall as we originally thought it was. You know, already there was a sort of power imbalance between NATO and Russia perceived before this war. That power imbalance seems to be even more lopsided now. So I'm wondering what conclusions should we draw from that when it comes to NATO strategic planning, when it comes to building a stable European security after this war? Because obviously we may be doomed to inhabit a very insecure situation if there is such a power imbalance, and presumably, we as people who want to inform policymakers should aspire to something more than just an exclusively deterrence-based system that could be extremely unstable and prone to escalation for years, if not decades to come. So your thoughts on that, Daniel?
Yeah, thanks. I must say I'm rather more in the camp of not being able to take any concrete assessment of what's going on in Ukraine, simply because, after February, everyone was already talking about the capitulation of Ukraine and Kiev, and already thinking about what the settlement would look like after that. Of course, if you have Russian forces landing in Kiev, that's probably the assessment you make. I think today we're in a very different military situation to what we were at the beginning of the war, just after. And keep in mind, of course, that many of the arms deliveries that Western countries have already pledged, in particular when it comes to tanks, armored vehicles, etc., and who knows what else in the future, they're yet still to reach the field, and they're yet still to have an impact. So I would say that I think everyone needs to be really careful about looking at where the military balance sits. And I do believe that the core of this discussion is really on where the military balance sits eventually. I'm not sure you can really have any real, 100% knowledge of what negotiations should or will look like or when they will happen, unless you have that military balance resolved on the ground. When it comes to NATO's arming, I'd just like to point out that, a lot of European countries who have supported the Ukraine armed forces have done so with old Soviet systems. And in doing so, they've emptied their own inventories of quite important capabilities, actually. For example, if you look at Germany and the recent announcement of the special fund of 100 billion, most German analysts will tell you that that's not going to be any excuse for Germany to think about marching on Moscow anytime soon, but it's simply to revitalize already pre-existing NATO targets that had been there for years, if not decades, and which had been and which the country had failed to live up to. So I think a lot of European armed forces today, it's not a question of building up their armed forces for, expeditionary or counterattack. I don't think that that's the point. But it is about making sure that what you said, Zach, that a minimum level of deterrence and defense can be seen to. So I think that that's important. The issue that Paul raised, I think, the current state of affairs right now in the conversation in NATO and its role in the Indo-Pacific, most NATO officials, and I think most, fairest, observers would say that there isn't a military role for NATO in the Indo-Pacific. And this is actually one of the big problems for NATO, I think, that you have at least the US who may have their own ideas about what containment of China looks, but European allies not agreeing with that. So I think the alliance have a challenging future there, although the strategic compass does try to square that circle, does try to square that circle as well. One final point as well, I think that what's also very difficult for the US is that even in the US case, if they argue that the national interest is that actually they don't want to escalate or get involved in some degree of escalation with Russia, it would be very interesting to see how they then manage the alliance as a whole, because I'm pretty certain those states who feel the threat from Russia much more acutely than others will not really give the US an excuse to go down that trajectory. And you're already seeing that, I think, within NATO Europe, where there is a big schism between those states that are bordering Russia or close to Russia and have a very different historical understanding of Russia versus those states who have some proximity or distance. So I also think that for now is held. But that's why I say I think all of us have said that it's going to be challenging in terms of who occupies the White House in the future, for example, where European allies sit in all of this. And the US have played a mediating role on that, but it's contingent upon the direction that the alliance takes, I think, with Ukraine. Thanks.
Gotcha. Thanks very much, Daniel. We have a question from our audience, which I'm going to pose to both Kerry and George, which concerns the recent delivery of Abrams tanks and Leopard tanks to Ukraine, as well as the potential for delivering fighter jets as well. Basically, the question reads: do you agree that the delivery of these weapons would, number one, change the balance of power on the ground as it relates to the actual battle itself? But throwing in the additional question of escalation, is this something that does indeed significantly raise the stakes towards escalation in this conflict, or rather, has the West actually, by maintaining a sort of gradual approach, sort of being a frog in boiling water kind of approach, slowly but surely ramping up the amount of assistance given to Ukraine? Is this actually a safe, delivery that can nonetheless help Ukraine to achieve some of its goals, and perhaps even, one could speculate, cause Russia to feel enough pain that this could clear the ground for some sort of settlement or talks at some point, and to make those a little bit more palatable in the months ahead. So Kerry first, and then George.
Can we do it the other way? Do I think it'll change the balance of power? I think that it will change the conditions on the ground along what was a 600-kilometer front starting to appear on the ground. So there are two things happening in the war. There's the geopolitical analysis that folks like us deliver, and then there's the people being killed in villages in the Donbass and beyond. So for those people being killed in villages in the Donbass and beyond, and villages, towns being taken over, and where Russian atrocities are being committed, I think once the tanks get there, they'll make a big difference, and that's pretty important. Will it change the balance of power? I think this is about much more than that ground war, to be frank. Changing the balance of power. And again, that change in the balance of power, the time is not yet ripe to talk about what balance of power we want to see, what the point is when we can start to push for a negotiation, because Ukraine needs to consolidate a bit more its position in that part of the country. Do I think the West's approach has been appropriate? I think they've been careful to stay on that side of the line, not directly confronting Russia, but there's been a dance then. So the West says, no, we won't give you this. Originally, it was no lethal weapons. Then they changed that pretty quickly. Then President Zelensky, who's a brilliant communicator, goes and speaks to their publics and said, no, we really need this. People are dying. Then there's a little bit of delay. And then the West says, okay, well, we'll give you the tanks. Will we go to fighter jet? Will the West go to fighter jets? I don't know. I'm guessing yes. Is that appropriate? Depends what's happening on the ground and how many lives you might end up saving, because it is also about saving lives. And I know the risk of escalation. I know it. But I actually, at some point, Putin has started to understand that they're losing and that he will lose if there's an escalation. So I don't know if the risk is actually higher of escalation the more we put in, the West puts in. I think it's the reverse. I do think the West has been too slow, because they end up saying yes to Zelensky. He needs it to solidify his position on the ground. And I think we're too slow in responding to him, to be frank. I think we should get out ahead of it, very carefully get out ahead of it, and give the Ukrainian armed forces more of what they need so they can consolidate their position sooner. And who knows, maybe then we can get into a place where some negotiations could start. But the Ukrainians have to, I know, George, you said that it's not up to them to decide, and you're absolutely right. But I also don't like the pure realist position that discounts the agency of a bunch of smaller states and bigger states in Europe, like Ukraine and the Baltics. They too have agency, says the woman who worked for Canada, who also has agency. We don't always all do what the US tells us to.
Not always. But George, do we always do what you tell us to do, or?
Well, I will refrain from answering that question, but
Right.
on the question of agency, the official position of the U.S. government right now is that it is up to Ukraine to decide if and when or whenever it might want to negotiate on this, and that the decision rests in Kiev, not in Washington or anywhere else, which I think, ironically, is depriving the United States of agency in all of this. And I do think the United States has agency, should have agency. These are issues that do affect American national interests. We do and should have a voice in all of this. So on the question of the delivery of tanks, main battle tanks, and the potential delivery of Western fighter aircraft, I think what's going on here is that we're actually in a struggle with the Russians over how this war is going to be fought. The Russians recognize that they cannot defeat Western technology. They are at a disadvantage when it comes to precision-guided munitions. They're at a disadvantage when it comes to real-time intelligence. And what the Russians want to do is not go, pair their weaknesses against our strengths. They want to turn this into a war of attrition that plays to Russia's strengths. They want to make this a war of volume, a war that takes advantage of their vast geographic distances. They want to wear us out over time, exhaust our ammunition, take advantage of the decline in Western defense manufacturing capabilities that's occurred over the past several decades, and take advantage of what they see as the West's limited strategic patience in all of this. So I don't think they want to escalate it, and they don't want to go against Western strengths in all of this. But by the same token, we don't want to see this war fought on Russia's terms. We recognize that if we're having this debate 2-3 years from now, we're in trouble. Ukraine's in trouble and the West is in trouble. So we're trying to provide technological advantages and intelligence advantages that can force an end to this war. And what we haven't reckoned with, I don't think, is how that is ultimately going to work. Is what we're providing the Ukrainians going to allow them to drive Russian forces entirely off of all Ukrainian territory? And if it is, how do we do that without the Russians escalating in some way? And the vulnerability that we have here, I think, is largely space. The Ukrainians can't use all this whiz-bang weaponry without the support of satellites. Those satellites are vulnerable. And right now, the Russians have refrained from attacking that weak link, A, because they fear it would be escalatory, but B, because I don't think they feel like they have to right now. They still feel like their war of attrition strategy can work. But if it starts not to work, if the Ukrainians really achieve some sort of breakthrough in the battlefield that puts either Crimea or the land bridge linking the Russian Federation proper with Crimea at risk, I think the incentives that the Russians will have under those conditions to escalate and to go after that weak link in the West go up considerably. And I think that's a big problem. So what I think we have to do here, if we're really going to try to drive the Russians to the negotiating table, we're going to have to pair the military support that we've been providing to the Ukrainians with a diplomatic strategy. Right now, we don't have that. We're using coercion. We're using all stick, or to use the Russian expression, all whip and no cake. We're going to have to bring together that coercive part of what we're doing with a message to the Russians that we're actually willing to talk to them about these issues. And unfortunately, the Russian perception right now, as I understand it, is that the United States simply will not negotiate over these big geostrategic issues with the Russians. That's off the table. And so long as the Russians believe that there's no prospect of any kind of compromise on those other issues, then the choice that they believe that they're in is they fight, or Russia ceases to be a great power, and in ceasing to be a great power, ceases to exist, because the Russians believe that they have to be a great power to survive. So that's the situation that we're facing, and I think we're going to have to figure out how we negotiate a way forward here. And I think it's going to have to involve pairing military support with diplomacy.
Gotcha. Thanks very much, George. A reminder to our audience that our panel concludes at 1:15 so please do stick with us until 1:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time if you can. In the 20 minutes we've got left, I'd like to unpack a little bit of the bigger picture and talk about some of the implications for Canada. So, Lee, if we could bring you back into this discussion, because I know that you've done research not just on Russia, but on China as well. And 1 year into this war, I'm wondering if you can give us your sense of how robust the Russo-Chinese strategic partnership is at this point in time, and how that should inform the West's calculations.
It's a very important consideration, obviously, and I would say, just as there's an old saw about Russia is never as strong as it looks, Russia is never as weak as it looks. I would apply that same description to the Sino-Russian alliance. In other words, while it remains, as it has always been, a partnership that is useful to both sides in its own way, but we should never exaggerate how close it is, and nor should we be anticipating any major split. I think I'm among those who believe that Xi Jinping was and his entourage were rightfully miffed when the invasion took place, because if there's one thing that the Chinese do not like, or no country really likes, but in China, particularly given the sensitivities of the Chinese Communist Party, it's instability. And obviously, this invasion brought a whole whack of instability to the international system. And it also can be read as having important implications for China's top international priority, namely what it considers its top, domestic priority, reunification with Taiwan. So we should never underestimate the degree to which that has miffed the Chinese and puts limits on what was already always a cautious partnership, even though it serves both sides. Presently, though, it does seem that while China is not going to cross any lines in terms of violating Western sanctions and give Russia more tangible support, it is happy to be a market, especially at discount prices, for Russian energy and other exports, which have been affected by U.S. sanctions. But in general, it's certainly not. It's a partnership not without its sensitivities and challenges. So again, we want to be careful about giving it more weight than it deserves. Ultimately, my last point would be, though, I think this is an area for future diplomacy. I'm one of those who it gets dismissed, but trilateral diplomacy, that ultimately sensible decision makers in the Kremlin appreciate that one consequence of this war and its geopolitical consequences is their increasing dependence on China. And that is not a comfortable place to be. And this, if not today, certainly down the road, is something that we in the West want to keep doors open so that we can play on to try to shift the trends in world politics in more favorable directions.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. And I'd just like to invite all of our panelists, if they see any questions in the Q&A that they'd like to respond to just by typing in an answer, given that we have a shortage of time left, please feel free to do so. But Paul, let me come to you next. We can obviously debate the legitimacy of or the size of what sort of role NATO as an organization should be playing in the Indo-Pacific region, but there still is the strategic question of China itself and what NATO's approach towards China should be as it relates to this current conflict in Ukraine. And given the differences that Lee and others have just highlighted, China being a country that needs to retain access to Western markets, to Western technology in order to continue its modernization, China being a country that has benefited to a significant degree from the status quo, and Russia, being a country that appears fully revisionist now and just running roughshod over international norms. Are there significant enough wedges in the Russo-Chinese relationship at this point that we should be seeking to exploit in one fashion or another? Do you think that that's a productive endeavor for NATO states to undertake?
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, I'd agree with Lee. This is it's not an alliance between Russia and China, but they're not going to be split apart. I don't think that is a realistic assessment. But we could achieve we could achieve such a thing. And I do tend to worry when I hear, the word containment use of China, because China's not the Soviet Union. It's a very different beast. And I remember the Soviet Union. I'm old enough to have actually been there several times and studied there as a student. It was not a very good economic model, and it didn't look like it was going to collapse when I was there. But of course, we know in hindsight that it did. But the Chinese have enjoyed, I think, 40 years of economic growth. It's like at rates of 10% or something. It's simply unprecedented in world history. So the rise of China is not something we can stop, if we're going to be quite realistic about it. Okay, it will continue to grow economically, and it will be the largest economy in the world from here on in, with the Indians in second place. And this is something we have to, I think, accept and grow to like in some way, or at least view as an opportunity, rather than something we need continually to contain. Because I'm not a Sino expert, but I get the sense that, in this sense, a bit like the Russians, but if you try and contain them, they don't like it, right? And you get pushback. So I think we should try and, I don't know what it would be, but we need some new language. We pick up these old models we have from the Cold War, because that's the language we have in international affairs, and those are the phrases we know. But we probably need a whole new model to think about how we deal with this. I think of Tolstoy, who said that the great man is not someone who changes history; it's someone who knows where history is going and puts himself at the head of it. Okay, well, history is going towards China. It just is, right? So how do we stop trying to be King Canute, holding it back, but actually in some way put ourselves at the head of this to bend it to our advantage? That's how I think we need to be thinking.
George, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I fully agree with Paul's sentiment that we need to understand where history is going, and try to walk in that direction. I think there have been a number of people in history that have talked about that's what talented statesmen do: listen for the footsteps of God and walk in those directions. But I would argue that the future is not Sinocentric, and I'm not sure that that's what Paul meant to say.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I think he's saying, look, China's going to be a great power. Not the great power, but a great power. I think the direction that history is going is toward a multipolar order. And that multipolar order can be disorderly and violent, or it can be relatively managed and relatively harmonious. And of those two, I favor the latter. But we're not going to be able to stop the world from becoming multipolar. And the degree to which the United States and the West tries to do that, I think, will come at our own expense. So I think we need to be understanding that the world is moving in a multipolar direction, that we need to be arranging a balance of power within this. And we need to be trying to come up with some relative buy-in to what the rules of this order are going to be. What's in bounds, what's out of bounds. I do think that is a reasonable ambition, and that is probably the best hope we have for making this transition from what has been a unipolar order since the end of the Cold War toward the world that we're heading toward.
I saw that Kerry wanted to come in as well, but let me just first go to Daniel, if that's okay, and then Kerry, I'll give you the floor along with Lee and Paul to wrap us up. Daniel, I'm wondering if you could comment briefly, because you did raise the issue of the Indo-Pacific, and George has just raised the question of the future of international order writ large. While NATO has certainly demonstrated a significant amount of cohesiveness amongst itself and amongst other allies or partners in the so-called global West, there is the sense, if not the reality, that NATO has failed to craft a global coalition to resist Russia's aggression. So is NATO, in fact, despite its greater cohesiveness, losing the battle to shape the future of the global order, which may indeed be shaped in the global South?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure to what extent it should necessarily be a NATO-centric discussion. I think it's a bit more broader than that. If you want to put the moniker the West on it, I think that's the broader problem here, which is, in fact, when you think about Russia and China, one of the more immediate impacts of that partnership or love affair or whatever you want to call it is in fact the power of persuasion that they have over large parts of the world. That we probably in the West have taken for granted for so long. And it's actually one of the big, I would say, blind spots that we've had in our strategy, that we almost immediately thought that everyone would be on our side simply because a country like Ukraine's sovereignty had been tested. But you see all of the ways in which the narratives can be manipulated in that regard. So I think it is not necessarily a NATO-only problem, but it's a problem that we have in the West as a general narrative, story, or lack thereof of a strategy to that regard. And of course, things like food insecurity have not helped, because of course even the narratives behind that of who is ultimately responsible for it has been instrumentalized as well. And we shouldn't also underestimate the feeling of maybe kinship is far too strong a word, but a sense of historical community between the non-aligned states, and that still rings very, very true, I think, in many countries in Africa and in Asia as well. However, those views are liable to change. You know, the closer and closer you get to different systems. So if you reject the Western system and you embrace the Chinese system, that also comes with certain flaws. And many governments around the world have also seen that firsthand, what it looks like. So I think actually George's point is there's a fundamental issue here, which is no one fully understands what global order should look like today. And I think many of the let's say certainties of the past, especially the multilateral order, international institutions, they're being called into question. There's an erosion of those, of that order that the West has built up. What comes in its stead, I think, is something far more messy. That's why you see the proliferation of many bilateral, minilateral initiatives in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. So I'm not sure anyone really has a handle on what it should look like. It's a kind of go softly approach. But it also means that for Europeans in particular, and certain countries in the Indo-Pacific, you see a much closer coming together or an alignment of interests in countries such as, South Korea, Japan, Australia, reaching out much more to Europeans and to the United States as well for that reason. So it is messy, but there is, no one's got a handle of it, but there is some degree of rationality underneath it all. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Before I finish with the Canadians, let me just ask George one last question, which comes from the audience, from Akash Maharaj, and he asks, what kind of security context should NATO prepare for, assuming Putin loses his war in Ukraine? Would you expect a Russia, for example, that withdraws into itself for a time, that strikes out or lashes out rather to reassert its power, that descends into internal chaos? What's the most likely scenario, you think, in the event of Russia losing this war?
Well, it depends on how you define losing the war, of course. In some ways, I think the Russians have already lost the war. If you posit one of the goals of the initial invasion was to seize Kiev and put a Russia-friendly regime in place there, the Russians were not able to do that. And I think they've shown that they will remain unable to do that. So Ukraine is going to emerge from this in one way or another as a sovereign independent state. The question really is where the border's drawn. Now, if you're talking about, Russia potentially losing Crimea and either, lashing out in an escalatory way or, collapsing internally, both of those I think would be quite bad from the point of view of American interests. Obviously, an escalation scenario could, be catastrophic for the world, but back in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union broke up, one of the big concerns that we had here in Washington was what happens to nuclear weapons? To what degree does expertise that was inside the Soviet military and its scientific community in chemical weapons, biological weapons, that sort of thing? To what degree does that proliferate into the outside world? To what degree can we contain the lack of governance inside Russia, in Chechnya and the various so-called frozen conflicts that resulted from the breakup of the Soviet Union? How do we contain that instability? If the Russian Federation were to implode, I think these would be very real and very difficult problems that would have real implications for the rest of the world. And I'm not sure there are any good ways of handling those problems, quite honestly. I think we got lucky in the 1990s to a considerable degree, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was not even more violent and unstable than it was. And by historical comparisons, this was not an enormous problem, far from what happened in Yugoslavia, for example. So I think that kind of scenario is something we should not look forward to.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's finish with Lee, Paul, and Kerry. If you do want to respond to anything, I know you wanted to come into the discussion. So if you if you wouldn't mind being a little bit brief in your response to anything that's already been said, because the final question I have for you is Canada-centered to all three of you. We've discussed over the course of this session the questions surrounding building the future of the European security order, dealing with the China challenge and the Indo-Pacific, more largely, more significantly, in the role that NATO has in all of the above. That's a complex policy agenda. That's a hefty policy agenda. And I wonder if a country like Canada can really meaningfully address both of those challenges at the same time. So my question to leave our audience with some food for thought is, should Canada aspire to do more than just coordinate with allies on those two major policy questions, the future of Europe's security order and dealing with the China challenge? Or rather, if Canada does want to have a significant role in one of those two challenges, do we have to prioritize one over the other and make sort of a clear statement of this is where we're going actually to make our impact? So let's start with Lee, then over to Paul, and Kerry, I'll give you the last word.
Briefly, Zachary, I think we need to up our game across the board. And my view is that Canada, we like to think otherwise, but we have been lulled. We've had the luxury of being the benign northern neighbor of the world superpower for all of living memory. And that has meant we have been able to free ride, and that foreign policy, more often than not, has been a very convenient instrument for our government to pander to selective domestic audiences, as opposed to bring the resources to bear and bring the hard policy, heavy lifting to bear on international issues, whether we're talking engaging Russia or the Indo-Pacific. So my short answer is yes, both. We need to up our game in general.
Okay, Lee says all of the above. Paul, all of the above. Do we have to choose? Your thoughts?
Well, I'm not an opponent of free riding. I mean, if you can free ride, why not? I mean, this is a policy which seems to have served us pretty well in the past. Why spend more than you have to when you're not going to get anything more back from it? The only reason for inputting more is if you have some idea of how things should be different, right? Then it is maybe worth investing some more to gain some influence in order to put that alternative vision into place. We don't have an alternative vision at this point in time. I don't see one coming. But, go back to what I was saying about China. I was saying, we need some new way of thinking about it. Well, if that's what, I don't know what it is, but if we as a nation want to have some influence on the world stage, then we have to have some ideas like we did with human security and so on in the 90s, right? But at the moment, our ideas just seem to be, pretty much, in conformism with, the general NATO viewpoint, right? And if that's the case, well, then we're not really, there's no point investing anymore because we're just going to go along anyway. So either have some new ideas or free ride. I mean, that would be my take on it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And obviously raises some important questions about what sort of new ideas Canada could have given the shifting place or role that human security occupies in today's world compared to the 1990s. And Kerry, last word over to you.
I don't even know where to begin. The question's too huge. I think if your question was, should we focus on Asia rather than Europe? The two are intimately interconnected. We can't choose. But if the question is, what's Canada's role in that new world that is more fraught, more strategic surprise? Canada's never done so well playing in the superpower space, because we're not. But where Canada has done well is focusing on those issues where we can build coalitions, where we can lead with ideas, and where we can do that in areas that fill a gap, either a gap in international norms or a gap in international accountability, something. So if I were to do my short list, I would say Canada needs to focus on the areas we're good at, where there are gaps in international norms, and on issues that are of interest to Canada. So what are those areas? I don't know what your short list would be. I would, if we're talking security, rebuild the guardrails that were put in place immediately at the beginning of the Cold War that have started to fall apart. Focus on accountability. Focus on governance gaps, Arctic and the high north with what Russia's been doing. If you're going broader than security, I have a slightly different list, but food security would be one because we're good at ag. So I would pick out those issues where we can be thought leaders, bring together regional coalitions that cross, because the risk right now is that it's the West and the rest, and the West is getting smaller, and that's not a good place to be. We need to rebuild that messy multilateralism across regional groups. And that's where I would suggest taking Canada. But in order to do it, I go back to Lee's point, we have to reinvest. We've lost the capacity to lead on policy. We've lost the space to do the diplomacy that we used to be really good at, and we need to rebuild that. And that takes some serious work in political leadership.
Sounds indeed like a generational task almost. So we look forward to debating these issues and much more, and hopefully digging even deeper into them in the months and years ahead. So thank you, Kerry Buck, Paul Robinson, Lee Sardi, Daniel Fiat, and George Beebe. A real pleasure to see all of you. I hope you'll join us again at IPD before long, and thanks for enlightening our viewers. We'll see you